There was a room in my first house that I visited so often, my husband stopped noticing when I disappeared into it. That's not a figure of speech. I mean, he genuinely stopped looking for me, and it took me 2 years to understand that this was never an accident. It was the whole point. My name is Anna Miller. I'm 29 now. What I'm about to tell you happened when I was 20, in the first year of my marriage, in a small back room that still visits me sometimes in dreams. This is Anna's Ordnung Stories, the channel where I finally say the things I was raised to carry in silence. If you want the truth about plain life from someone who actually lived it, subscribe, tap that like button, and tell me in the comments something I think about often. Were you ever taught that staying quiet made you good? I read every comment. I knew his mood before he said a single word. I knew it from the way his boots sounded on the porch step, heavier than usual, and the way the screen door did not close behind him so much as it was released. A half-second too late, so it clapped instead of settling. I stood at the stove with a wooden spoon in my hand, and the whole kitchen changed temperature around me, though nothing in the room had moved yet. I did not turn around right away. I had learned not to turn around right away. A wife who turned around too quickly, with her face already asking a question, was a wife inviting whatever was coming to arrive faster. Here is the rule, and I want to say it plainly, because it took me years to understand how deeply it had been placed inside me before I ever understood what it was asking of me. In my community, a husband's anger was not something a wife challenged. It was not something she questioned or explained herself against or asked comfort for once it had passed. It was something she survived quietly, the way you survive weather. You did not stand in a field during a storm and ask it to reconsider. You went inside, you waited, and when it passed, you returned to your work as though nothing unusual had occurred, because in the eyes of everyone around you, nothing unusual had occurred. This was simply what marriage sometimes was. I learned this lesson before I ever married. The way I learned most things, from the older women around me, spoken so gently and so early that it never once felt like a warning. I remember sitting with my aunt during a quilting circle when I was maybe 16, half listening the way girls do at that age, when she said, to no one in particular, that a good wife learns when to step away. Not argue, not explain, step away. She said it the way you'd share a recipe, practical, useful, something to be grateful for once you needed it. I did not understand, at 16, that she was handing me a survival skill disguised as a virtue. Eli was not a cruel man in the way people sometimes imagine when I tell this part of my story. He did not raise his voice often, and he never raised his hand to me, not once, in all our years together. His anger came the way weather comes to a man who has been taught his whole life that anger is a private storm he alone is allowed to have, and that everyone around him is responsible for managing its landing. I was never taught to fear a blow. I was taught to fear a feeling, his feeling. And I was taught, long before I ever married him, that managing his feeling was somehow my job. The evening I remember most clearly began over something so small I am almost embarrassed to tell you what it was. I had made a meal that was slightly late, no more than 20 minutes, because a hen had gotten loose and I'd spent the extra time chasing her down rather than starting the stove. But Eli had come in from a hard day in the field, tired in the particular way a man gets tired when the work has not gone well, and the lateness of the meal became in his mind a small proof of something larger. Some carelessness in me, some failure to keep the house the way a house was supposed to be kept. He did not shout. I want to be clear about that, because the absence of shouting was itself part of the lesson. He simply set his hat down harder than usual and asked, in a voice gone flat and cold, why the food was not ready, and I felt the whole kitchen tilt, the way a room tilts right before you understand you're about to fall. I did not answer him. I had already learned by then, less than a year into our marriage, that answering was its own kind of risk. An answer could be heard as an excuse, and an excuse could be heard as defiance, and defiance was the one thing a wife in my world was never, under any circumstance, permitted to offer a husband whose feelings had already begun to darken a room. So instead of answering, I did what I had been trained to do since long before I understood I was being trained at all. I set down the spoon. I wiped my hands on my apron, and I walked quietly, without looking at him, into the small sewing room off the back of the kitchen, and I closed the door most of the way, not all the way, because closing it all the way might have been read as its own kind of statement. And I sat down in the one chair in that room and folded my hands in my lap and waited. I do not know how long I sat there that first time, long enough for the light through the small window to shift position on the floor, long enough for my own heartbeat to slow from a gallop down to something almost normal. I did not cry. Crying, I had learned, was for afterward in private, never in a moment when it might be seen and read as an accusation against him. I simply sat in that small room full of half-finished quilting and spools of thread, and made myself as still and as quiet as the furniture around me, until I heard his footsteps settle somewhere else in the house. And I understood, the way you understand weather has passed, that it was safe to come back out. Nobody in my world would have called what I did hiding. They would have called it humility. They would have called it patience or wisdom or the discipline of a wife who understood that a calm house was worth more than a wife's need to be heard in the heat of a moment. My own mother, when I told her once, carefully, years into my marriage, that I sometimes went to a back room when Eli was upset, nodded with something like relief on her face, as though I had just told her I was doing something right. "That's good," she said. "Better to let him have his quiet than to add fuel where there's already fire." She meant it kindly. She believed it completely. She had done the same thing herself, in some room of her own, for longer than I had been alive. But no one told me what happens when the room becomes the only place you feel safe. Because that is what happened to me, slowly, over the following 2 years. What began as a specific response to a specific moment, a temporary retreat until a particular storm passed, became something else entirely. I began to feel calmer in that small sewing room than I did anywhere else in our house. I began to notice myself drifting toward it, not only when Eli was angry, but in the hour before I even knew whether he would be. I would hear his boots on the porch, and before a single word had been exchanged, before I even knew what kind of day he'd had, some old animal part of me would already be calculating the fastest, quietest route to that door. I was not simply escaping his anger anymore. I was disappearing in advance of it, shrinking myself smaller and smaller in anticipation of a storm that had not yet arrived and might never arrive at all. I began speaking less at the supper table, not because anything had gone wrong that day, but because speaking felt like risk, and risk felt like something I could no longer afford. I began keeping my opinions folded up small inside me the way I folded linens, pressed flat, put away, rarely taken back out. I stopped asking for things I needed, comfort, rest, even simple conversation, because asking required a version of myself that took up space, and I had been taught, so gradually I never felt the teaching happening, that a wife who took up space was a wife inviting trouble into her own house. That is when I finally understood what the room had actually been teaching me, underneath the language of peace and patience and humility. It was not protection, it was training. Every time I walked through that door and folded my hands and made myself quiet and small, I was practicing a kind of disappearance. And the more I practiced it, the easier I became to overlook entirely, not only by Eli, but by myself. I stopped noticing my own fear because I had gotten so skilled at not showing it that eventually I stopped feeling entitled to name it, even privately, even to myself. The two meanings of that room have stayed with me ever since. There was the physical room, small and quiet, full of half-finished quilting, a door that never closed all the way because closing it all the way might have looked like defiance. And there was the other room, the one inside me, the one I built out of the same materials, silence and stillness and the folding of my own hands, where I learned to put away my voice, my needs, my fear, and eventually something closer to my whole self, the way you put away a chair you've decided you no longer have space for. I understand now, at 29, what I could not understand at 20, sitting in that back room waiting for footsteps to settle somewhere else in the house. The peace in that house was never really peace, it was fear, dressed patiently, practiced quietly, passed down from mother to daughter in kitchens and quilting circles as though it were wisdom rather than survival. A house can look calm on the outside for years, while one person inside it is slowly disappearing on purpose, one small room at a time, because she has been taught so gently and so completely that her own vanishing is what keeps everyone else comfortable. I was told this was normal. It wasn't. If you were ever taught that staying quiet made you good, that making yourself smaller kept the peace, that disappearing into some room of your own, real or otherwise, was simply what a good wife or a good daughter or a good woman did when someone else's anger entered a room, I want you to hear me say this clearly. That silence was never holiness. It only ever made you easier to overlook. Tell me honestly, in the comments, were you ever taught that staying quiet made you good, when really it only made you easier to control? I read every single one, and I will not look away from what you tell me. Choose your freedoms wisely. They might just save your life.